Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens. We're going to jump right in. America is standing at one of the most consequential economic crossroads in its modern history. The headline number is staggering, roughly 39 trillion in federal debt. But the real story isn't simply the size of that number. The real story is what happens when the government consistently spends more than it collects. When the cost of servicing previous borrowing continues to rise, and when economic growth isn't strong enough to close the gap. America's not bankrupt, and there is no evidence that the United States is on the verge of an imminent economic collapse. But the physical trajectory is serious, and the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office show why this issue can no longer be treated as someone else's problem. Now, to understand the situation, we first have to separate three numbers that are often confused: the national debt, the annual federal deficit, as well as the debt which is held by the public. The national debt represents the government's accumulated borrowing, and the deficit is the amount by which federal spending exceeds the federal revenue in a particular year. And the debt held by the public measures a portion of the federal debt held outside of the federal government itself. These distinctions matter because looking at only one number creates a misleading picture of America's financial position. Now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government is expecting to run a deficit of about 1.9 trillion in the fiscal year 2026. Federal revenues are projected at roughly 5.6 trillion. Federal outlays are projected at about 7.4 trillion. That means Washington is expected to spend considerably more that it collects even while the economy is not experiencing a recession. The CBO projects the deficit at approximately 5.8% of GDP in 2026, which is considerably higher than the average annual deficit of 3.8% of GDP over the previous 50 years. And then comes one of the most important parts of the story: interest. Federal government doesn't simply borrow money and forget about it. That borrowing has to be serviced. The CBO projected net federal interest costs at approximately $1 trillion this year, and by 2036 those costs are projected to reach approximately 2.1 trillion annually, which is equivalent to 4.6% of the nation's entire economic output. An increasingly large portion of the federal budget could eventually go towards servicing debt rather than funding the current government priorities. Think about what that means for the future. The interest payments don't create a new bridge, they don't build a new school, and they don't increase military readiness or directly provide a new government service. They are the financial cost of borrowing that occurred previously. And when that debt becomes larger, changes in interest rates can have a much greater effect on the federal budget. And this is why the debt problem isn't simply about reaching a particular dollar figure. It's about the relationships between the debt, interest rates, the economic growth, government revenue, and federal spending. The CBO projects that the federal debt held by the public will rise from approximately 101% of GDP this year to 120% of GDP by 2036. That would exceed the previous post-World War II high of 106% of GDP, recorded in 1946. The CBO's projections also show the debt continuing to climb beyond that point. But here's where we need to be careful. Saying America has a serious debt problem does not mean America is doomed. The United States possesses enormous economic advantages, and it has the world's largest economy, deep financial markets, and a highly developed capital system, substantial productive capacity, and a currency that plays a central role in international finance. The U.S. Treasury securities are among the most important financial assets in the global economy. However, those advantages give America something many countries don't have, which is substantial financial flexibility. But the flexibility is not unlimited. The United States can borrow because the investors continue to have confidence in the country's institutions, economy, and ability to service its obligations. Maintaining that confidence is extremely important, and the danger is not necessarily that America suddenly runs out of money, The more realistic concern is that rising debt gradually reduces the government's ability to respond to the future emergencies and places increasing pressure on economic growth. And the current economic data make this particularly important. The latest Bureau of Economic Analysis advanced estimates shows that real GDP increased at an annualized rate of 1.5% during the second quarter of 2026, following 2.1% growth in the first quarter. The consumer spending, investment, and exports contributed to the second quarter growth, while declining the government spending partially, which offset those gains. So the American economy is still growing, and that matters, but the growth of 1.5% is not the same economic environment as extremely rapid expansion, and the inflation remains an important consideration. The latest BEA data show personal consumption expenditures, the price index of one of the Federal Reserve's closely watched inflation measures, increasing at a 5.1% annualized rate in the second quarter. The core PCE inflation increased at 3.4% of an annualized rate. And that creates a difficult environment for the policymakers, and if inflation remains elevated, the Federal Reserve has less room to aggressively ease the monetary policy without worrying about the renewed price pressure. But if economic growth weakens significantly, the pressures increase for policymakers to support the economic activity. Meanwhile, the federal government continues borrowing, and this brings us to the structural issue. America's fiscal problem isn't primarily about one president or one Congress. It has accumulated over decades. The Republicans and Democrats have both governed during periods when the federal debt increased substantially. Tax policy, spending decisions, military conflicts, economic recessions, emergency programs, healthcare costs, demographic changes, and entitlement obligations have all played roles. The arithmetic doesn't belong to one political party, and the solution won't be found through political slogans. Eventually, Washington has to confront the gap between what the government promises to spend and the revenue it collects. That could involve some combination of spending reductions, the tax increases, entitlement reforms, stronger economic growth, or changes to other federal programs. Every option carries consequences, and cutting spending can reduce the government services. Raising taxes affects households and businesses. Reform Social Security or Medicare will create difficult political and social questions, and relying entirely on economic growth is risky because no government can guarantee future productivity. That is why the debt debate is so difficult. There is no painless solution, and postponing the decisions don't eliminate the costs. It simply transfers more of the problem into the future. The CBO's projections also illustrate just how significant that challenge could become. By 2036, the federal deficit is projected to reach approximately $3.1 trillion, or 6.7% of GDP. At the same time, net interest costs are projected to reach $2.1 trillion. The CBO was warned that the projected fiscal trajectory is not substantial, and that word unsustainable is important. It does not mean an economic collapse is scheduled for a specific date. It means the government cannot indefinitely continue on the same trajectory without eventually facing consequences or making significant policy changes. Those consequences include higher interest costs, reduced private investment, slower economic growth, and greater pressure on future taxpayers, and fewer options when the next major crisis arrives. The CBO's long-term analysis has warned that rising debt can strain policymakers and create significant risk for the economy as well as the federal budget. Imagine another recession. Imagine another pandemic. Imagine a major war. Imagine a financial crisis require extraordinary government intervention. The United States has historically responded to the emergencies by spending enormous amounts of money. The more debt America carries before the next crisis begins, the less fiscal room Washington has when the crisis arrives. That's the part of this debate that should concern concern everyone, regardless of the political affiliation. The question isn't whether America can survive another $1 trillion of debt. The question is how many additional trillions the country can accumulate before the cost of carrying that debt begins significantly restricting the choices available to future Americans. And that brings us back to the phrase breaking point. The breaking point probably won't arrive as one dramatic moment. There may be no single morning when Americans wake up and suddenly discover that the United States has collapsed. And I'm sorry, instead the breaking point could emerge gradually. It could be the year when the interest payments consume resources that lawmakers desperately need elsewhere. It could be taxes have to rise because deficits become politically impossible to ignore. And it could be the spending cuts become unavoidable. Or it could be when financial markets begin demanding significantly higher compensation for the lending to the federal government. Nobody can predict exactly when or how that happens, but we can examine the trajectory, and the trajectory deserves attention. America still has tremendous economic power, and the country has extraordinary technological capabilities, productive businesses, educated workers, and enormous capital markets, and a global financial system built around the dollar. Those strengths give the United States an opportunity that shouldn't be wasted. The solution isn't panic. The solution is arithmetic, transparency, responsibility, difficult decisions made before those decisions are forced upon us. Because the national debt isn't simply a number on a government website. It represents accumulated borrowing, and it represents interest that must be paid. It represents promises that future budgets will have to accommodate, and ultimately it represents choices. America can choose to address the problem while it still has significant economic strength and financial flexibility. Or America can continue pushing the problem forward and leave future generations with fewer options and a larger bill. The United States is not bankrupt. The American economy is not collapsing today, but pretending that the fiscal trajectory is harmless would be just as irresponsible as claiming that economic collapse is inevitable. Truth is somewhere in between, and that truth is serious. America has the resources to change course. America has the economic strength to address this challenge, but strength doesn't eliminate arithmetic, and time doesn't make debt disappear. The longer Washington waits to confront the structural imbalance between the spending, revenue, debt, and economic growth, the more difficult the eventual choices could become. The question facing America isn't whether we can afford to care about the national debt. It is whether we can afford not to. And that's where this conversation ultimately comes back to you, the American taxpayer, the American worker, and the generations that will inherit the decisions being made in Washington today. The national debt isn't an abstract figure confined to government spreadsheets. It can influence the taxes we pay, the programs government can afford, and the interest rates Americans face, as well as the economic opportunities available in the years ahead. There is still time to make choices rather than have choices made for us, but that requires something Washington has struggled to demonstrate consistently: the willingness to confront difficult numbers before they become even more difficult problems. So as you look beyond the headlines and the political arguments, remember the central issue: America's economic strength is real, but so is the fiscal challenge. And the United States has the resources, institutions, and productive capacity to address it, but eventually the mathematics has to add up, because the decisions being made about America's economy today won't simply shape today's headlines. They will help determine the economic landscape of the next generation and what it inherits. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. And if you found this analysis informative, please make sure to subscribe, share this video, and stay informed. And as always, we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Peace.